Designer Note Subject 100. The story of this channel is pretty simple so far. We had a lot of time on our hands, limited equipment to work with, and a few ideas for content. I'm sure there's a few of you out there who's in the same boat as I am. So here's a few tips to maximize the use of your mobile device and tell a better story. Like, comment, and subscribe for content you'd like to see next. Follow us at Instagram at Design Atelier Aruba for behind-the-scenes content. Email us at designatelierviewer@gmail.com. The main equipments I use for my videos are really just an iPhone and an iPad. It's pretty remarkable what we all can produce now with our mobile devices. By focusing on these tools, I can devote the rest of my channel's budget on other things such as my next watch purchase. Some of the channel's budget did go to some other items to improve the quality of the videos, such as the cheap lighting equipment, some camera lenses, and stabilizing mounts. All of these tools should be available at under $200. I also purchased some software for the iPhone and iPad. These apps make it easier for post-production and add a few more visual effects. For around $250 of extra equipment and software, I am now ready to create a high production content. What's more interesting though is that you don't really need to spend that much to achieve the same effect. Let's begin with the video frame rate. Many mobile phones have the ability to select the frames per second. Most are set at 30 FPS, and some can even go as high as 60 FPS. Traditionally, movies are shot at 24 FPS, and by selecting this frame rate, our eyes are readily reminded of cinematic visuals. The channel's content has always been shot at 24 FPS to create that familiar look, but if you want a more contemporary or TV show feel to your videos, you can choose 30 FPS. 60 FPS is mostly used by video game channels to match the game's frame rate. It's also a given that maintaining a constant frame rate adds a professional look to your footage. Every review channel needs a reliable stand. I initially made use of a makeshift phone stand using Lego bricks, but a cheap phone mount would go a long way for your videos. The idea is the more secure the stand, the less vibrations on the shot you'll have. This sounds logical, but you do need to keep in mind that setting the mount on the table will also expose the camera to shaking. A floor set mount is generally better to avoid shaky footage. A floor stand also gives you greater flexibility on your work area. In the setup I made, my whole chest area is free from all obstruction. I have greater mobility and keep my focus on the subject. Lighting is one of the most vital elements of any video production. Many would invest much of their budget on good quality lighting. You can achieve the same effect if you time your shots right and plan your location. The best light that is relatively available everywhere is, of course, the natural light from the sun. A carefully placed set beside a window can do so much for a shot. For review desks, it's generally more pleasing to have your light above your frame or slightly at the upper left or right position. This main light is known as the key light in photography. This, however, is best complemented with a fill light or a light that fills the deep shadows created by your key light. You can play around with the location of these two lights, but in general, I use the Rembrandt light placement. This, in its simplest, is placing the light at the upper left frame to create a portrait-like shadow with the fill light shining over the deep shadow that's created. This also makes your hand definitions more three-dimensional and less flat. If you can't afford a second light, you can also buy a cheap whiteboard to reflect or absorb light. Now that we have the scene set up, manning the camera deserves attention. It's easy enough to just mount the camera on a stand and show your hand and the product in frame. However, B-rolls of footage are needed to make this visually interesting. After all, it gets boring really quick if you see the same shot over and over again. B-rolls of footage are just shots of footage that can be used to supplement your main shots. It's best and most convenient to use slow motion shots for your B-roll. It hides all the shakiness of your hands and you generally shoot a lot of footage in a small amount of time. Back to your A-roll or main footage, it's very important to make it interesting. As much as it's nice to display other things on the table, it's still what's on your hand that should have the spotlight. By creating the distance between the table and product, you can achieve a dimensionality through depth. Make use of your camera's autofocus to blur the background. This same idea is applied on the foreground. This cinematic technique of defining the foreground and background elevates your shot from being flat. This is also where apps like Filmic Pro for the iPhone is useful, since you can lock the focus of your object. For further tracking shots, a 3-axis gimbal is very handy, but a little cloth on the table can also work at minimizing the shakiness of your videos. Getting closer on the details is one of the key elements of products that pulls the audience interest. As much as the camera lens on your camera is technically a breakthrough on its own, sometimes it still needs some help. Buying a cheap macro lens for your phone can improve your shots in creating a better quality video. Pair this with proper lighting and you can explore new areas to your video captures. When shooting macro shots, it's generally a rule of thumb to mount your camera to remove any movement. Any small movements can make violent camera shakes that every disaster movie would be proud of. We don't want that. So to create a more dynamic macro shot, we hop into the editing room, in this case the iPad, and track the shot from there. Slightly enlarge your footage and move it from point A to point B. If you know you're producing a 1080p video, then shoot everything in 2K. It gives you enough room to track your shots while not losing the quality of the video. You can also use a cheap rotating stand to create those beautiful turning shots, or use a large cloth again if you're in a tight budget. It's convenient enough to point a camera at a subject and click on the shutter button, but with a little more extra effort, you can improve your videos drastically by thinking about transitions. When shooting a subject, think about what your next shot will be. Now end your current shot with a movement that you will begin with your next shot. These simple movements are entertaining and nurtures your creativity. Transitioning from device to device is another important thing to keep in mind. Since I'm using iOS devices for the majority of my daily tasks, it makes perfect sense for me to keep in that same technological ecosystem. It makes it near seamless for me to work on my videos. I can shoot something and immediately send it to my iPad for editing. The less the apps to work with, the faster I can get my videos out there. I use lumafusion in editing my videos. I found it has all the tools I need and it's easy to learn. One example is when editing my audio to my footage. I make use of a cinematic technique called the J-cut. It seems logical that when you cut your footage, you also cut the audio in the same timeline. In a J-cut, the audio plays first ahead of the video, or vice versa. This creates a connection between the two scenes. It's a small and subtle thing, but it makes a big difference. Do not neglect the value of using sound to your video. In sound design, I would also typically look at the big changes in the audio and use this as places where I would cut my footage. This makes it seem that the footage is in sync with the video. Another thing we can now take advantage of is the use of green screen or blue screen in some footage. These mobile editing apps are now powerful enough to use green screen on them. One of the more complex shots I've done before is pulling a watch from the screen. Here, I began with swiping my finger on the screen to show the green screen. I quickly removed my hand out of the shot to give myself options to cleanly transition to the next shot of the watch. I would then cut this on the editing room by superimposing the screen on top of the green screen part of the footage. There are other ways at adding graphics to your video production. But since I'm already using Procreate to draw and create graphics, I opted to design my whole video presentation around these two apps. When I shoot my footage, I follow my script and hold my pose on certain parts that need some graphics. I would then draw the graphics on Procreate and then send it to lumafusion. Once in lumafusion, I would then try and track the graphics on the footage. It all seems to be a lot of work, and to some capacity you thought right. But after making 100 episodes of these, I'd like to think that I'm getting better and faster at it. The most important thing for me is the fun that I'm having when I'm looking at the new ways to shoot these subjects. Just looking at how I used to produce this content compared to what I can do now is just cathartic. Looking back at my collection, it reminded me of the journey at how the channel grew in just a few months. The channel was created to tell interesting stories in small and short notes from a designer's standpoint. Oddly enough, Cobbs here represents the cobbled up and improvised nature of the channel. I got him from eBay at a relatively good price, minding about the budget of course, and enjoyed wearing him all the time. At some point though, I left him in the Philippines to find a new home, only for me to miss him so much, my first horological regret. So I took to heart and sought to get him back, and here he is, now a staple in the collection. He's not perfect, but he has my signature kinks and dents on him. It's a lesson for me that sometimes making do with what I have is definitely better than not having it anymore. We had a lot of fun together, on a limited budget no less, and inspiring ideas along the way. Enough at least for the next 100 episodes. Thank you so much to everyone who supported the channel and to everyone who promoted the channel to their friends and family and to their other channels. It matters so much to me, and it's a big part of why we keep making these content. Thank you.